Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I know that many people are watching this event from around the world in different time zones. So this is an event organized by Refugee and Migration Lab. Particularly, this is to celebrate, to observe World Refugee Day 2025. So at the beginning, what I want to say, just let me say a few words about Refugee and Migration Lab. The RML is the research collectives that draws on diverse academic knowledge and expertise to address the escalating refugee crisis, dynamics of forced displacement, and evolving migration challenges. Its goal is to foster multidisciplinary dialogues that educates, informs, and when possible offers fresh approaches and meaningful research outcomes to reducing conflict, inequalities, and injustice. So we have organized to this kind of panel discussions. We have extraordinary, brilliant panel of speakers from different continent and different academic settings to share their research and experience on World Refugee Day. And this event is supported by University College London as part of its one of the project's activities titled as Politics of Denial and Non-Recognitions of Genocide. At the beginning, I will welcome Dr. Bias Ahmed, PI of the project from UCL, to say a few words to welcome our guest and audience. Mr. Bias.
Yes, thank you, Professor Nasiruddin, and I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm Dr. Bias Ahmed. I work at University College London, and this is a very special day for academics and also globally people who observe and who really care about the refugees, people in crisis, and all this conflict, violence, and war happening worldwide. And definitely, today's theme is about refugee rights in a challenging time, and we are glad to be a partner with the Refugee and Migration Lab. And this is part of the project called, funded by the British Academy. We are organizing this event, and the project is called Politics of Denial and Non-Recognition of Genocide. So you understand the genocide is the crimes of the crimes, definitely. And we know refugees are coming from, it's an outcome of any violence, crimes against humanity, war, conflict, and of course, war crimes and also genocide is also integrated part of refugee dynamics and global geopolitics. Just to quickly give you an overview, currently there are 123 million displaced population worldwide. Out of them, 36.8 million are refugees. But remember, even twice the number, that is 74 million people, are internally displaced as well. So, I mean, we really need to care about refugees are protected by UNHCR, but there is twice the number of people, or sometimes 3 times more people who are internally displaced, not protected, and they are more vulnerable. For example, back in 1971, during the liberation war in Bangladesh, 3 out of 7 people were displaced. Okay, and 1 out of every 7 people, they were refugees. They moved to India, around 10 million people, but another 20 million people were internally displaced within the country, and we really don't talk about this. And globally, I quickly want to finish and wrap up. I just want to mention a few things. We all know there is aid cut, international aid cut happening because of that. In the camps, in the Rohingya camps back in Bangladesh, the World Food Program, for per person Rohingya refugees, the allocation for food was $12 per month. That has been reduced to $6, and now there is further discussion ongoing. Probably it will be reduced to $3 per month per person. Do you understand? With $3 per person per month, what can you provide for 1.3 million refugees Rohingya refugees back in Bangladesh. So serious geopolitics, international funding cuts, aid cuts, and also we are familiar with what is happening. Even those who really want to talk about all these global conflict, violence, war, and protection of human rights, refugees, and internally displaced people like us, academics, different types of courts are there, national, international judges, activists, and scientists. They are being targeted. We don't have freedom of speech. People, all these different groups of people are being targeted, even killed. They're being killed in a targeted manner, scientists, academics, both within the national and international periphery. This is a serious problem. Even if you want to talk about this, we cannot talk. Justice is being denied and delayed, both for all types of justice. You talk about genocide, you talk about crimes against humanity, war crimes, or even different types of human rights violation. So it's a serious global problem we are facing. Not only the victims themselves, I mean, they are the ultimate victims, of course, the refugees, the displaced people, the people who are facing the conflict, like in reality, but those who are also, we are not part of the conflict, but we want to raise our voice, we want to talk about it, we want to ensure justice for them. We are being targeted both at home, at abroad. Our life is at risk. You know what is happening in different universities worldwide, being sanctioned, international aid being cut, those professors are being just terminated, and students are being seriously targeted. Their visa is being revoked. It's worldwide. It's not one particular country. Even from my country in Bangladesh towards the West and everywhere. So I mean, it's a complex problem we are facing, both the refugees and those who really want justice for them. I believe today's discussion from all these esteemed speakers will highlight different issues, and we come to a policy identification. What else can be done for a safer and really a much beautiful and peaceful world for all of us? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bias. It's your wonderful notes, and I think it's a wonderful beginning to talk about today's theme. We set the theme today as the refugee rights in our challenging times. So what we got a kind of, actually we are living in a really challenging times. So in these challenging times, how refugee can actually and entitled to their different kinds of rights. So with this challenging time, how we could, particularly academia and scholars, could contribute. So we are hoping to generate wonderful, very vibrant discussions. So without further delay, I will welcome Bree Kinson. We have the beginning. I already told about it. We have very brilliant speakers from around the world. So first of all, I will welcome Bree. Bree, are you here? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here. Hear you well. Thank you. All right, should I get started? Okay. All right, let me just share my screen here. Okay. Does that look good, Nasser, the screen?
Nice,
Okay. Okay, fantastic. So thank you so much. What an important panel, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm so looking forward to the discussion from the panelists as well as everybody else who's here. I wanted to use some visuals. I think visuals can be very powerful in my remarks to start today. I'll talk for about 10 minutes. And it was hard to decide which angle to take today because I think we are living in a bit of a bleak time right now. I was at an international humanitarian conference a few months ago and talking about the future of humanitarianism. And this term was knocking around a lot in the conversation, this idea of inhumanitarianism. So this idea of right now we're kind of in this setting of profound setback in human rights. And things are looking pretty bleak, but I kind of want to frame it and discuss it in terms of my remarks today. So as was mentioned already by Yaz Ahmed, which was a wonderful opening remarks, thank you so much. That at the end of 2024, we have over 123 million people who have been forced to flee their homes, communities, and countries. And I'm starting with the statistic that we all know. We're probably going to hear it multiple times today. But I think it really underscores the importance of today. So that's 1 in 67 people who are displaced on the earth. And displacement has actually doubled in the last decade, and it's propelled by current conflicts like Ukraine and Gaza. And now we're also looking at increased displacement due to what's going on with Iran and Israel. I often think of this quote from Warsan Shire. She's a Somali British writer and poet who was born in Nairobi and lives in London. Her main interest is in writing about and for people who are generally not heard. Immigrants and refugees are one of the groups that she writes with and for. She had this quote, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, where does it hurt? It answered everywhere, everywhere, everywhere. And I think that this is such a profound poem because I think it captures what's going on in the world right now, and at least how I'm feeling about the world. I've done research for about 20 years in places such as Chechnya, northern Uganda, Palestine, Afghanistan, and Syria, and now in Bangladesh with Rohingya families. And my research has really been trying to trace this hurt in the cracks of everyday life. And in these contexts of extreme adversity, so things like war, disaster, climate change, political violence, and displacement that results from that, families are still engaging in everyday practices, which is kind of the focus of my research. Parents are making sure that their children are going to school if they can, if school's available. Families are sitting down for meals together, if they have food to put on the table. Couples are getting married if local laws allow them to, and babies are being born if there's access to health services. So, despite these adversities, families are just trying to survive in the face of what I've termed violations of the ordinary, these violations of daily life that humans, families should be able to engage in and aren't able to engage in because of displacement, conflict, war, climate change related disasters. So just to give you an overview of some of the context, in Gaza, there's over 85% of the Palestinian population there has been displaced. I'm sure we're following this, all of you are following this in the news. Over 70% of homes have been destroyed, structures, infrastructure. Starvation is now being used or has been used for quite a while as a weapon, and the population is facing catastrophic hunger and famine. In Ukraine, we have 6.5 million refugees living abroad. It's Europe's largest exodus since World War II. And due to martial laws in Ukraine, that require men to remain and fight, 70% of Ukraine households are women-led, leading to additional challenges in families. We have Sudan, which is 107 million people displaced. It's the world's largest IDP, so internally displaced persons crisis, that no one really knows about and we're not talking about in the media. 19 million children have been out of school for 1 year. That's a huge amount of time in a child's short life. And there's examples of targeted sexual violence, there's forced recruitment of child soldiers, and there's also a trend towards starvation as well among those communities. So I want to kind of frame this when I'm dealing with something challenging like what's going on in the world right now. I like to intellectualize, maybe like a lot of you, kind of figure out what's going on. And I'm really interested in this idea of the rise of inhumanitarianism. So I want to describe it, and then I want to apply it a bit to the Rohingya case as my final slides. So one of the biggest threats today is what I'm seeing as inhumanitarianism. Inhumanitarianism is really this deliberate erosion of empathy and the systemic dismantling of protections for displaced persons and refugees. It's really been surging in recent years, and it's fueled by three intersecting forces. The first force is political isolationism and xenophobia. This is where we're seeing around the world that wealthy nations are really rejecting their responsibility to protect or to take in refugees. They're outsourcing refugees to poorer countries. So we'll see 70% of displaced people are hosted in low to middle income countries. So, for example, Bangladesh, right? There's also rhetoric shifts that are xenophobic. So refugees are framed as invasions, aligned with the leader of Italy, security threats, which echoes the UK's Rwanda plan, to resettle refugees in Rwanda, or economic burdens, which is reflective of Lebanon's approach to Syrian refugees over the past decade or so. There's also austerity and aid cuts. Donor nations such as the US have slashed their humanitarian budgets in a very cruel way, especially the US. It's a very cruel process by which they slash their budgets, not to wind programs down, but just to stop, immediately. And another example is the UNHCR 2025 gap report shows that only 22% of education programs are going to be funded for children this year. So huge, huge cuts that are really impacting people. And then dehumanizing technology. This is something that's kind of interesting arising in the research and also kind of what's going on in the world with refugees. There's surveillance happening in camps. So there's facial recognition in camps. For example, Bangladesh is using biometric IDs for Rohingya in the camps, which can enable mass tracking, and these can be, problematic. There's also algorithmic cruelty, where you have AI-powered border drones at the US-Mexico border or in the Mediterranean, and also social media disinformation. So we're seeing a lot of this in Facebook and Instagram, where you have these kind of anti-refugee bots that are, spouting a rhetoric that is very xenophobic as well. So I just want to apply it to Rohingya. I'm a little bit nervous about this because I know everybody here is probably a bigger expert on the Rohingya than I am, considering the audience. But I am doing a research project there with a wonderful research team, and I want to kind of highlight a little bit of these humanitarianism elements with the Rohingya. So this example really illustrates the complexity and the insidiousness of this age of the inhumanitarianism that we're living in. So as you all know probably, but I'll repeat it for those who don't, the Rohingya is a stateless ethnic group. It's one of the most persecuted minorities in the world, experiencing a genocidal campaign consisting of horrific acts of violence, the burning of their homes and villages back in Myanmar. And now they're the target of globalized inhumanitarianism as well. The Rohingya fled their homes, or the remains of their homes, in Myanmar's Rakhine state, where many had lived for generations. And the majority of these individuals sought refuge just across the border in Bangladesh, where many of you from the audience are living. It was one of the largest and fastest moving displacements of a population in recent history. Bangladesh has a no integration policy, which refuses work rights and education, claiming that they're hosting Rohingya refugees as temporary. So there's no safe return yet established for Rohingya to return back to their home country. So this is really this political isolationism that has led Rohingya to be perhaps forever refugees, which is, problematic and very hopeless, right? There's approximately 1 million displaced Rohingya in the camps in southern Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar region. Many of the camps are the size of large cities, but they don't have the infrastructure that a large city would have to support these large numbers of Rohingya families that are living there. Population density is less than 15 square meters per person. It's far below the 30 to 40 that is required under the international sphere standards for humanitarian aid. And a common complaint among the families that we work with in our research is that they just don't have enough space for everyday activities like eating together, sleeping comfortably, engaging in livelihood activities. There's no space. And we hear this echoed from family to family that we talk to. And it really compromises their life, but also compromises their dignity. The US was providing 50% of aid to the Rohingya in Bangladesh, but aid cuts have really been weaponized politically. So the global trend is that countries like the US are slashing their humanitarian budgets, and they're prioritizing their own border walls over human lives. The worst case scenario, that the Rohingya cuts would be halved for food rations. That was narrowly averted, but it sounds like it's happening again. And it's really taking a visible toll, pushing refugees towards increasingly desperate coping mechanisms. We're also seeing that coupled with shrinking protection measures, so cuts to legal aid, cuts to child protection, and that's leading to things like more trafficking, more forced labor. So these are the outcomes of that. And then also there's dehumanizing technologies that exclude rather than protect. So Facebook has not stopped their algorithms that amplify hate speech. They're the source of hateful speech about refugees around the world. Biometrics are still being used in humanitarian assistance, and there's the potential for misuse and discrimination. And one of the things we found in our research is this increase in online gambling among families. So gambling addiction in the camps is causing even more financial hardships for families and then leading to criminal gang activities such as kidnapping, trafficking, and violence. Despite all of this, and I'll end by talking about maybe a little bit of the hopefulness, despite this rise in humanitarianism, there's still some signs of hope. Organizations and communities are discovering they don't need millions of dollars to do something significant. And I think that's really something important to keep in mind as we talk today. Our research also shows how families are surviving still, despite all of these adversities. So, despite aid shortages, this was a picture I took back in April. The camps are still bustling microeconomies, which I think is very optimistic and hopeful. We're also seeing children in school, they're hungry to learn and develop their skills. They're just so thirsty for knowledge, and I think that's a really great thing to capitalize on. One mother that we spoke to is engaged in creative ways of earning income to pay for her children's school fees. And there's so many resources within the communities. There's Rohingya who are, around the world that are, let me just get my notes here, here and around the world that are not just recipients of aid, but they're also teachers, they're healthcare workers, they're translators, they're leaders. We actually have an amazing young group of young Rohingya who work with our team, and Nasser knows them as well. Some who are poets, they're artists, they're journalists, they're photographers, and they're researchers, and they're sharing their stories and they're sharing the stories of their community with the public in order to attract attention and to shift narratives. All these people really enrich the social and the economic fabric of the host community as well as the origin community. And I'll end with this quote I love from Howard Zinn that will hopefully spark ideas for actionable solution. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic, it's based on the fact that in human history, it's a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. And if we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. So I'm urging you to think, this is this age of in humanitarianism as I'm proposing, but there's also a lot of hope and a lot of possibility for us to do good things. So I'll end there and pass it over to Nasser. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's wonderful to listen to you and see a lot of wonderful photographs. And thank you so much for bringing the issue of, Gaza and Ukrainian crisis, Sudan, and also Rohingya in particular. So just to give you kind of housekeeping information. If you have any questions, please put your questions at chat box so that we can talk about it after the deliberation of speeches by our panelists. Now I will welcome Professor Palash Kamrujaman from University of St. Louis.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much, Professor Akason and Dr. Ahmed, for helpful introduction to the audience. There will be some overlaps, but I'm grateful that I might not need to expand a lot more from there. I do not have any slides, so I will mainly talk about my reflections and lived experience of researching with the Rohingyas. So let me start with a little bit of political sarcasm, maybe. We live in a time when one has to offer something, especially to the powerful, in order to receive help, get help. What I mean by that, when I say that, I hoped that it might ring the bell, that some of you might just hear that at the highest level of political theater that was televised live, that one president was talking to another president, that you are in no position to dictate how we are going to feel. Or you are right now not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. You don't have the cards. I hope it now by clear, what I mean, right? Well, I'm trying to say that if we look at this example, the refugees we are talking about today, and the IDPs as well, that these are one of the most vulnerable people. Let's just bear that in mind. And some of my reflections will probably come clearer in the end. As a context, I'd like to also talk a little bit about refugee conventions, the 1951 refugee conventions. Bree kindly mentioned that 73% of the refugees are hosted in the low and middle income countries. Most of them are poor, they're not very rich. So in one of my recent research visits in Southeast Asia, repeatedly I was asked, what do you think of this? Why don't your country, I mean, now that I've become a naturalized British citizen, why don't your country take so much refugees? And Bree has also covered this, that is probably outsourcing the global countries, signatory countries, those have signed those conventions and probably are like much more resourceful in terms of economics and finance. They're probably outsourcing, or in other words, they're keeping the problem at that part of the world and resisting people to travel this side of the world. So since this panel wish to focus on the challenges and rights of the refugees in a challenging time, two just among so many, two just came to my mind, and I'm inclined to talk about those two, mainly about their right to live a dignified life and the right for education. So to begin with, my experience tells me that no one I have met choose to be a refugee. I have been privileged to know a few refugees from my research and for personal life. I know Syrian families who were industrialists but became refugee all of a sudden. But maybe some Ukrainian refugees who probably have been in a similar position, who were having a decent life. Apart from these two, or maybe some others, which I am not aware of, majority of the refugee groups I have met are very, very poor. I understand many people are have significant expertise on Rohingyas here. I'm aware that some Rohingyas have lost their land, properties, some businesses, but those might not be called as wealthy business people. Regardless, I'm trying to take a simplified position. So what I'm trying to say that in most cases, all refugees, regardless of their wealthy status or not, they have lost dignity in many ways. I have recently led a study as a principal investigator to understand the experience of violence and loss of dignity among the IDPs in Afghanistan and the Rohingyas in Bangladesh. Our publications are out, and where we highlighted how they feel that dignity has lost along the way. But that's just for the context. But what I'm trying to focus is that my reflection is that not all refugees are same. What I mean by this is that it's just not like they're same, they don't look same. Refugees are treated differently based on skin color or ethnicity or some other characteristics. When I say this, one might recall the treatment of Ukrainian refugees, how they have been treated, or as recently, how the African or South African refugees are being treated by the US. Of course, refugee groups, I have nothing against any refugee group. I'm just saying that there is this inequality and discrimination, right? So the idea here is that different refugee groups have different needs from their status and all these issues. So the whole idea about this need and this discrimination highlight what Professor Uddin has written about this subhuman life. So some refugees are treated as human or probably more than human. They're more adorned, welcomed, appreciated. And some are treated as subhuman, burden, and other traits like Bree has highlighted, less than human. So I'm inclined to clearly say that refugees, from my experience, are not a homogeneous category, and we need to be aware of that. There is a clear discrimination and politics of recognition and treating this group of people who we broadly call as refugees. So we need to understand that, and it is important that whatever we have in terms of refugees, and we need to recognize that they have a right to live a dignified life. Since the reality is very, very distant from the theory or the promises or the legal conventions even, it is imperative to recognize that it deeply undermines the very first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which insists all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Even in refugeehood, they are not equal in terms of dignity or in terms of their rights. That is clearly the case in my experience. So I argue that they have a right to have a dignified life. My second point is about education. And again, this is from my personal reflection. My research has taken me to some of the worst refugee camps in the world. I might choke. I mean, I'm a passionate person. What hit me hard in those camps and visits, the despair in the eyes of the refugee children and their parents. I have been embraced by refugees. I embraced some of the refugees, and I love that. I have no hesitation to say that I did that. The informed audience must be familiar that there are so many works that calls for right for refugee children's education. In my experience, many times that we have been to different camps, especially in Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Indonesia, I can recall a parent came to me and say, "Sir, our life is gone. Can you do something for our children? We do not do our children's life to be like ours." They clearly fear that their children are not getting an education, and there will be serious consequences for those generations as well. But that brings me to this point, what Bree has also touched upon in terms of the rise of inhumanitarianism. The 8 cards, I said at the beginning, we live in a time that is a little difficult, that is a little different, weird. We have all the money in the world to go to wars and kill people. We are able to invest billions to send human to another planet, but we don't have enough money to support human beings and the refugees and to support their education and other rights. No, I'm not a dreamer. I do think I understand the reality and pragmatism. I understand what I'm saying that might seem like a pipe dream, but that is the problem when I see that one group is treated differently from another. And when we see there are money for other things, including killing people, and not for supporting vulnerable people, including refugees, that seems quite problematic. What is the rationale we have been given? That we don't have enough money, we need to be balanced, budgets needs to be well managed and all these things. I don't need to repeat again, as this has been said, that this is cruel and inhuman. The problem is, I don't think with the geopolitical theater, in order to receive help and support, as I mentioned at the beginning about having or not having cards, imagine if a president is being told, you don't have any cards, what can happen for these people who have no cards, who never have any cards, the refugees? I might be called that this is oak virus. I have been affected by oak virus. There's so much gimmick, so much bookkeeping, so much rhetoric, but that's the reality. Apparently, we have lost that human touch to feel like those people are human. I hope today we think we should find a political goodwill to treat refugees in a dignified manner as human and in addressing the root causes, what makes people refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Palash Kamrujaman, and you have brought a lot of questions, a lot of issues. That's actually we want to address here. We want to talk about in favor of or on behalf of the refugees, particularly Bree was talking about Gaza, Ukrainian refugees, Sudan, and Rohingya refugees, and Palash Kamrujaman has brought a lot of issues, particularly the crisis of Syrian refugees and also different states of the Afghan refugees, and the question of health, education, third country resettlement, and also kind of dignified life. Yeah, a lot of issues we'll talk about in our follow-up discussions and Q&A sessions. Now I will welcome Professor Nargis Kanefi to reflect on today's topic, refugee rights in a challenging time. Nargis Kanefi, it's over to you. Please unmute. Unmute your device. Yeah.
Yes. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's loud and clear.
All right. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And the World Refugee Day is indeed one of those moments that we gather together and reflect on our practices and our work, as well as the condition of the several millions who are on the move, internally or internationally displaced, and those who are currently, in the light of the war in the Middle East, rendered perpetually stateless. So what I'd like to touch upon is, I mean, Nasruddin kindly gave some points of entry in terms of our discussion. And I was thinking about how to go deeper in them. One of them was the deepening awareness. Another one was amplifying refugee voices, role of refugee scholars, and suggesting actionable solutions. All of these four headings are very worthy of extensive debate, and there's work going on in these areas. But I think I'm going to really concentrate on number 2 in that list, which is amplifying refugee voices in tandem with number 4, which is suggesting actionable solutions. Somebody's mic is on. Okay. So what we do know from our work, and I'm currently located in Brazil, and I'm working with Brazilian scholars on environmentally induced and climate change related displacements, which is a very, very important agenda item for Latin America, but also increasingly becoming so in the Middle East and Asia. If refugees are generally treated as unexpected arrivals, which has been more or less the knee-jerk reaction to any mass crisis, unless you are a refugee studies and forced migration scholar, because we do foresee that, for instance, right now, there is a massive flow from Iran to Turkey and Lebanon and the surrounding states. There has been a steady flow from occupied territories to Egypt. None of these are unexpected for us, but for countries who are not at the receiving end, these might be perceived or construed as unexpected arrivals. Immediately, the question of institutional arrangements and possibilities of either return, orchestrated return, and if that fails, then inclusion are put on the table, which is the policy aspect of refugee and forced migration studies. And if refugees are considered as a surplus population, the institutional arrangements and the financial investment for that kind of inclusion matrix becomes all the more troublesome, and often the receiving global South society reaches out, as has been in the case of Syrians, for instance, for an international consortium of financial flow. Because obviously Europe is not going to receive the Syrians, but Europe is then asked to give money to Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and to Libya and many of the Eastern European countries to keep refugees at bay. And there's a lot of policy efforts made in these countries for inclusive policy measures, so that the refugees who arrived en masse do not move any further. Now, there's also a long-standing debate about whether this is inclusive exclusion as opposed to just exclusion, but I'm going to put that aside for the moment. And we also have the discourses of humanity, peace, and the rhetoric of the commons and the rights narrative, and other existential claims that somehow establishes a relationship of the donors and the victims, receivers, between the refugee communities and the quote-unquote host societies. So what I want to talk about is, how could you then activate refugee voices, and how could you possibly have accountable strategies towards refugee groups and communities when that relationship is on the get-go set as donor, receiver, donor, victim, benevolent society, and the thankful refugee. I'm not suggesting there's a big problem with that in terms of the maybe day-to-day understanding of the event, but for a scholar who works in forced migration, we do know that this is not about virtues giving. This is not about the benevolent hand. This is actually about global politics, global economics, and it is all the more observable when you deal with environmental and climate-induced human-made displacements, as I am doing right now in the southern cone of the Americas. So we also know that there are globally differentiated, but at the same time connected refugee policies of inclusion. So if the bar is set as those who adhere to the Refugee Convention and the protocol versus the many in the global South who don't, that's a very, very crude cut. And we do know that the temporary protection regimes are becoming more and more established both in the North and South. So engaging in that kind of discussion, I think, is very not only passé, but it's also dangerous, because historically we know that the majority of the global South countries who are the main receivers of refugee populations did not sign the convention, or they put conditions when they signed the convention. So there's got to be a different way of understanding the differentiated yet interconnected refugee policies of inclusion. The second aspect that's really important is the interrelationship between different professions working with refugees. No single profession works with refugees. So when there are policy matrices established, it has to be multifaceted and intersectional. I know, and rightfully so, there's a lot of emphasis on immigration and border policies. But once the refugees are, asylum seekers and refugees are inside, then the terrain really gets differentiated. Particularly important is areas of education, especially tertiary education, and recognition of qualifications of refugees. For my 10 minutes here, and the methodologies and initiative that generate robust, valid, just, and sustainable resources to facilitate and support what we call authentic experience of exclusion that leads to belonging, a sense of belonging. So we then move the debate from inclusion at the mercy of the host or receiving society to a sense of belonging that is actually multifocal and that's rooted and sustainable. So in terms of how we do this work, inclusion is often subject to metrics, indicators, but I fear that we measure what we value, and we also value only what we can measure, which is sort of a spiral closing onto itself. There must be other ways of engaging with refugee experiences, especially mass experiences and multi-generational experiences, to understand the true nature of the on-the-ground practiced implications of policies of inclusion. And the refugee well-being is commonly cited as a flourishing sense of belonging and having a diasporic experience that is nonetheless rooting, which is a very interesting and perhaps at least from the outset somehow a tense relationship. How can you be diaspora but at the same time be rooted? Because you cannot go back to the home country in the near future or in the far future, and then the second generation, the children born and their children are most likely going to be naturalized and remaining in the society where the refugees were received, and that has implications for the host society as well as the refugee groups. And so the well-being can not only be measured in terms of economic capital or natural capital or even human capital, but it also has the very important social and political component of how embedded do refugee communities become in the society where they eventually become a diaspora community. There has been new work that goes into capabilities. I know there's a lot of work on vulnerabilities, basically identifying the most vulnerable groups and accentuating our approach. But I am kind of on the side of capabilities approach more, or in tandem with vulnerabilities, which I think is important to move the discussion away from kindness, gratitude, benevolency to reciprocity and relationality of refugee experiences. So we also witnessed something quite unique, especially in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well. For instance, the European Social Survey revealed that younger generations are more open to refugee experiences and refugees becoming part of society than the older groups of people who are in their 50s and 60s and 70s, who are much more nationalist and much more worried about their society's cultural well-being and religious identity. And so in the future, I mean, we applied for a very large project last year with a Lebanese INGO to do a cross-cutting retraining of refugee youth in terms of media presence. We didn't get the grant, but just the preparation phase was very interesting because we were trying to bring together members of the youth from the receiving society with members of the youth from refugee communities and make them work together. And the pilot we did was very, very successful. So like there's a great openness among the younger generation for these kinds of engagements and being in touch. So I want to wrap up my little intervention here with the desire that refugees should be the authors of their own narratives. This desire is becoming increasingly vocal among refugee scholars themselves. And the understanding is that the international protection of refugees and those experiencing forced displacement and statelessness, they have a rightful place in the decision-making processes that impact them. So this is an academic initiative, and I think the Brazilian cohort and South American cohort has a lot to do with that initiative. But whether it would hold muster and whether, the organizations such as UNHCR or parts of the ministries developing policy packages, NGOs, INGOs dealing with donations would take heed of that desire and call is to be seen. I have a feeling that it might actually, assume traction, and the right to participate.
We need to finish. Okay, just
okay. Yeah. So it's a very new dimension in this debate, and I invite all of us to think about it further. If you have questions, I can elaborate more later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really, you have brought a lot of questions and a lot of points that we'll discuss in the follow-up sessions, particularly this how to amplify the refugee voices, and also interestingly, one debate, the majority of refugees are hosted by Global South. That's a big interesting, and also global geopolitics. And you have also brought a couple of very good questions, particularly Jordan, Lebanon, Syrian, a lot of cases. We'll talk about more, the follow-up discussions. Now I will move to Professor William Silcock. I don't want to just make further delay. Please.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for not being on earlier with us. Arizona is on the time zone of Los Angeles, and so sometimes it gets confusing because we don't follow the like lots of things in life. It's not always easy. So let me see if I can get my slides to show, and I will also let you all know that there we go. That I will be happy to send these slides to anybody who wants it. It's grateful to be with these colleagues, these scholars. I feel very honored to be invited to this session about refugee rights in challenging times. I'm at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University. It's going to be 116 degrees here today, so it's pretty hot, but that gives me some empathy for what the refugees go through, I think, as they cross the border. My professional background is academics from 6 universities across the globe, 2 Fulbrights, and then working at television stations from actually Anchorage, Alaska to South Carolina. What I've been doing as a scholar is making my Fulbright meaningful, even though I did one in Ireland in the 90s and one in Sweden in the 90s, and now a Fulbright specialist. But I continue to speak and do projects, especially around reporting passions. And one of my passions is, of course, the world of refugee reporting. We do global media training with colleagues through Educatio Global, which you can find on LinkedIn. But I want to begin with 2 guiding quotes. This is an American documentary filmmaker. His name is Ken Burns, and he has on his studio or his office in New York, Florentine Films, this quote: "We're all looking for ideas large enough to be afraid of again." I bet you're going to hear some scary ideas if you haven't already, and when we get into the discussion. I hope you do. I hope we put fear in each other's hearts and souls so that we can grow. Burns has another quote. He says, "Tell me stories around an electronic campfire, which used to be a television. Now, of course, it's your iPhone or your Android." The other guiding quote I want to use as I go through these, and I'll go through these slides quickly. I don't believe in death by PowerPoint, but I do want to make some points. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but irrigate deserts. And that's something to ponder from C.S. Lewis. Arizona State University needs no introduction. It's the largest public in the United States. Sorry, this is pixelated a little bit. We do have an interesting charter that says we are measured not by whom we exclude, but by whom we include. I was getting some facts together about, let me see if I can move that so you don't miss the slides. Because I am in the desert and I do a lot of taking international groups down to Nogales and the border. These are just some statistics I was able to find this morning. They're very bad at keeping statistics on this, but obviously there's been lots of tragic deaths of people crossing the hot desert of Arizona. I was looking in preparation for this at the theme from the United Nations. So this is the UN Secretary General. Becoming a refugee is never a choice, but how we respond is. And I think we respond as scholars, educators, teachers, journalists, and citizens. So I want to focus on the thing that's right there in red, our refugee voices and how we get them heard. And Nasir, when he asked us to prepare for this, he asked 2 questions among our, well, actually 4, but I'm going to tackle 2 of them among the panelists. What is the role of the refugee scholar, and how do we amplify the voices? And I added in red, you can see that line there, do journalists also bear the same responsibility as scholars? If I had a room full of journalists, and maybe there are some journalists in this Zoom room, some of them would push back a little bit and said, well, aren't we supposed to be objective and not get involved in the story? That's nonsense. The Cronkite School has done a lot of research on the word objectivity, and they did a white paper I can share you about called Objectivity and More, which means in these times we need to do some more. So let me tell you about the first assignment that Dr. Udin gave me and all of us, the role of the refugee scholar. So in his great book that I hope you're all reading, I worked with a colleague, Dr. Ali Hussein, who was at Cronkite at the time, but now is at the University of Sharjah. And he was the lead author, so I need to give him full credit on this great article about moral outrage at the border. What they did is they looked at 95 students and showed them some videos. If you remember, during the first Trump administration, children were being taken away from parents. And they showed these students those videos, and then they gave them some emotional reactions and had them complete a short survey. The basic headlines: viewers of child separation scenes felt a stronger obligation to help immigrants. That's probably a no-brainer. National nostalgia is really important. And participants cited shame and a loss of moral leadership and called for humane reform. The speaker just previous to me, Nirgis, was saying about how this younger generation has a different attitude about it than maybe the baby boomers or something. The final conclusion from that study was the book chapter, we show that negative feelings of outrage evoked by children's separation should be critically examined in the context of the humanitarian crisis, news media reporting, and immigration policy reform. So I love how we've continued to talk about the interplay between journalists and scholarship. Another place that I was involved in amplifying voices was in 2019 at the World Journalism Educators Conference in Paris. We did a panel discussion on how to report on refugees. You may know some of these names. The conference is going to be in San Francisco here in August. Dr. Tena Parison, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, from the University of Zagreb, our colleague from the Brosh Institute, from the EU, a good, wonderful professor, Mary D'Ambrosio, from Rutgers, were all there. And we learned a lot about how we can teach refugee reporting to students. But I've actually been very blessed to do refugee reporting in student projects since 2012. We've done them with the University of Zagreb under the leadership of Dr. Tena Parison. We did documentaries, we did websites, and of course, these were during the times, the first one there, reporting refugees, when we had the Syrian refugee crisis that came up through Greece and through Montenegro, North Montenegro, and into Serbia and Croatia, and what happened there. And then just last year in 2024, we were back in Zagreb because there are 25,000 war refugees from Ukraine. The diaspora are now in Zagreb. And so we did a story about displaced identities. That was done with the Cronkite School, the Missouri School of Journalism, and it was funded by the US Embassy in Zagreb. So even though we're probably may have some conversations about the changing policies in Washington about projects such as these, I can count on 10 fingers the number of projects funded by the United States State Department and local embassies about refugee reporting. And so that was wonderful. All right, what is the most important thing we teach our students about reporting? This picture reminds me a lot because when we were going to some of the early refugee camps from the Syrian refugees who were, stranded in Croatia trying to figure out how to get up through Slovenia and into Germany, Tena Parison kept telling the students, be tender, be tender, be tender. Try to, obviously put yourselves in those shoes, but it's so hard. And I remember very passionately listening to a man who had escaped from Iraq, got into Turkey, got on one of those boats in Greece, walked all the way through. I was back last year in Zagreb, so this was about 5 years later. He's now a full-time citizen of Croatia. He's got a job, he's married. It was an interesting part of the story to see it, how it comes full circle. And sometimes I think, because the pictures are so powerful as journalists, we don't tell the complete story. We don't tell the end of the story. There's so many voices, none of them without significance. I asked ChatGPT to tell me what are the common themes among ethics codes for journalists that talk specifically about refugee reporting. So there's a word cloud breakdown up there you can see. I've got about 5 minutes left here, so I'll quickly go through the rest of these slides to keep us on time. But, I think it's not surprising, but some things are important to emphasize. For instance, the very first one, The subject terms, what words we use. I think we have made some progress. I never hear the word illegal aliens ever anymore. That's just sort of wiped out of the discourse of journalism, at least in the United States, and the discourse maybe of citizens. And I think that's a good thing, figuring out what is the proper term to call it. But there is an ethical fine line, and that's something we always struggle with working with our students. Informing viewers about the human toll is so important, but too much visual coverage carries the risk of offending people, compassion fatigue, other scholars have written about it, and too little visual coverage oversimplifies complex issues, and it fails to inform the public about the magnitude of the horrors going on. Here's two pictures. These are the ones we want to share, but obviously the one on the right, it's two young children that lost their lives, but and in contrast to the one on the rest, on the I guess it's the right and then the left you see there. So that's the challenge journalists face every day, and they can't do it under deadline pressure. It has to be done in a classroom with professionals in discussion. So when the deadline hits, when they're on their phone, they know what to do and when to, shut the camera off, frankly. Sometimes there are happy sides to the refugee story. This is a very famous Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph from the Kosovo war crisis. And you don't often see the, and then we can debate this photograph for an hour. We're not going to do that. But, it does show hope. And maybe that's something that journalists maybe would get if we were grading them a C-, because there's never enough of those kinds of stories about that. I'm going to talk for a minute about a couple of religious scholars. This is Dietrich Uchtdorf, who's an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a war refugee in World War II, escaping from East Germany to West Germany. And he said in the very last line there, if I could go back in time and share a message with my younger self, I would tell him, don't be afraid, find a way to find hope. And that's what this picture does, is find hope. The Catholic Charities do a lot worldwide to help the refugee crisis. And here's, our current Pope, the recent Pope, both with key quotes, which I won't read. You can see those quotes later. But obviously, sometimes I don't think journalists have done a good enough job of looking at the partnership that religious organizations, as well as NGOs, as well as the United Nations, play in telling this entire story. I love this proverb from my good friends in Africa. I've run an international Humphrey Fellowship program at ASU for a decade and have many friends in Africa. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think we as scholars and journalists need to do that. And the last thing I want to say is, because I think there's probably lots of students or younger scholars on this Zoom, I hope you recognize there are lots and lots of studies to be done. I'm looking for right now someone who wants to jump in with me and do a study on the ethics of refugee reporting, how it plays out in case studies across the world by looking at those professional ethics codes. Well, let's come back where I began, here in the desert, where it's hot. But there's this thing in the desert of the Southwest, I have many outside my house, they're called cactus. And how they possibly thrive in this godforsaken land is beyond me, but they do. And they not only thrive, they bloom. And so I believe there's a lot of lessons we can learn from nature. I think the refugees would tell us those lessons because they're the ones out there, in all of the elements, trying to deal with the tragedies that they're dealing with, and how nature maybe literally had saved them or saved their families. I repeat again, the task of the modern educator or the journalist is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And so I hope that we are able to do that. I love this graphic for this World Refugee Crisis, World Refugee Day from the UN. A little Muslim boy, it looks like, maybe I'm stereotyping, but it looks like, because it's just coming off of some important Muslim events. And he's bringing hope, he's bringing light, and he's bringing solidarity through light. As educators and journalists, we educate to learn, we enter to learn, actually. We do our stories, we do our scholarship to learn, but then we go forth to serve and get the messages out to audiences. My alma mater for my PhD, the Missouri School of Journalism, has this building that you walk through, but at the top of the building, when you go through the building, there's embedded on the sign there, wise shall be the bearers of light. And I believe that's what a scholar is. I believe that's what a journalist is. And at the Cronkite School, we have a 6-story building in downtown Phoenix, and there's a piece of art embedded in the glass. And at night, you can see it reflects. And that art is actually called Windows of Light, the idea that society's challenges and problems pour into the building, journalists in a teaching hospital model of education and scholarship and research try to figure out how to take light and knowledge back out to the world. Thanks again for listening. I hope I didn't go too long. There's all my stuff. Happy to chat with you and email and connect and I'm sharing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Bill, you brought wonderful couple of issues, particularly the roles of journalism, journalistic reporting. Also, when Bree was talking about, and she also brought up this misinformations. A lot of issues actually came up, and very interesting. Now we will go for a kind of follow-up discussions. The follow discussions. There we have 4 panelists: Bree Atkinson from Wilfrid Laurier University, Professor Palash Kamruzzaman from University of South Wales, and Professor Nargis Kanefi from University of York, Canada. And I would request you could take points from other panelists when you follow up. A lot of issues we now already have discussed. You can talk about the follow-up discussion of your earlier speech, and also you can take some points from the discussions. But I will request you to maintain time strictly 3 to 4 minutes in your following discussions, because we can receive some questions from the audience, and you can also see some questions in the chat, so we can make it more engaging. And I would just like to let all of you know that this event is being broadcast live on different social media platforms, including Facebook, YouTube channels, Blue Sky, and Instagram. So many people are watching us, and we are trying to actually amplifying the rights of refugees in the challenging time. So
right.
Now, sorry,
we're amplifying. This is right. This is great.
Yeah,
We use
so
social media.
we are amplifying, because we are just circulating. We are talking about their rights and how we could actually work for their rights in a challenging time. I will go to first Bree Atkinson, please. Your follow-up discussions for 3 to 4.
Sure. Yeah. Just a few comments, and because I do want to get to some of the questions that are fantastic in the chat. So keep the questions coming for the audience. Yeah, I just wanted a few things that I wanted to emphasize from the other speakers. Dr. Kamruzzaman's idea of the right to dignified life. I think oftentimes research, or even our focus, we're always focusing on, and it's for good reason, like focusing on the material goods and, or, if people have food to eat and safety and things like that. But dignity is such an important part of the refugee story, and also looking at the impact of refugee displacement. And I think that's something to really focus on, is dignity, and how do we ensure families have enough to eat, have education, have healthcare, but also have dignity. And what is that going to look like? I think that's something for us to think about in the future. Nergis's, Dr. Kanef's talk is really interesting too. I loved what you said about kind of that dichotomy between benevolent giver versus this grateful taker. It reminds me of Barbara Harold Bond's work, right? Where she talks about, the right to, what that idea of the right to have aid is, and viewing that relationship as between those two. It makes the withdrawal of aid seem less malicious, to be honest, because it's seen as, oh, if it's a gift, then it doesn't have to be given. It's just given because of benevolence. But if we reframe it and see that as a right, as a human right, as a right of states, as a state responsibility, then I think that would be maybe a safeguard against withdrawal of that kind of aid. And also, I have a lot to say about the capabilities approach with youth, but we should chat another time. And then also what Dr. Silcock said, I think that idea of the importance of stories, and this is something really critical. I have a lab called Mapping Stories Global Research Lab, where we take our research, and it's about sharing the stories from the data that turn into academic publications, but how do we turn those voices and those stories into something that's actionable? And, there's so much, no one story is going to capture everyone's experience, but collected together, we're closer to understanding the experiences of people. I'm thinking of Dr. Uden's book on the Rohingya. Those collections of stories is so powerful. And I think we need to make sure that we are always kind of telling these stories in a way to put that human face on a situation. The biggest challenge, I think, is getting people to believe something they haven't seen. So I've been in the camps, I've been in all these different places, I've witnessed these things, but to convince other people it's a lot harder once you're there. So how do we do that? We can do that through stories, through visuals, through experiences, through connecting. So yeah, great discussion so far. I'll end it with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Professor Palash Kambrujiman, please.
Thank you. And I'd like to borrow, what Professor Bill said. It feels like, the same. I feel tremendously honored to be here. And I'll start with, what Professor Bree has said about our work on dignity. And as you can clearly see, that even the Rohingya Convention talks about all these rights, but they don't talk about right for repatriation, but it does not include that right for dignified repatriation. So our work on that project actually highlights how this notion of dignity can be applied and how this should be understood. So from the Kant's perspective, dignity is inviolable. So what we did in our research is basically to see these peoples are broken, these people are violable, they feel that their dignity have been violated, right? So the notion of the supernatural aspect of dignity as it cannot be broken as long as you're a human being, we wanted to raise that question. And it would be good to see in terms of refoulement and repatriation, because nobody wants to be go back to their country or wherever they come from and then being treated as burden or security threat or as second-class citizen or whatever, right? So that's the one thing. Of course, from both Nargis and Nargis and Professor Nargis and Professor Bill, I'm just pretty hopeful that I can see that there's this one question. The one thing that could led me to say, look, what can I do? I'm just a small person in this world where the people who are making decisions either to give aid or to cause the war are billionaires, right? Or something else so powerful. What can I do? But the hope is something that we never lose. We don't give up. We are human beings, right? And so many times, Bree, when I am in the camps, not only first time, I cried. I have no hesitation or shame to say that I cried because the situation is bad. There's no way of sugarcoating that this situation is good, that refugees are having a luxurious life. The issue is that many times I feel, oh God, thank you. It's not me, my wife, my father, my mother, or my daughter. I told you I was in the embrace of many refugees. So the other issue is this hope, the aspect of amplifying voices. I think that is important, and I'd like to raise this question. I think that there needs to be what we call co-creation, co-production. I know it sounds probably a little bit of catchphrases, but look, we feel as if refugees are not able to speak on their behalf, and that's where we need to come in. But probably given the spaces, all the videos, all the digital humanitarianism, we are probably using their stories. We are using their visuals, we're using the documentaries and all these things, the narratives. There must be some way to do this. And finally, I think I would be more keen that this is a barrier. I said that my talk is about my personal reflection. Trust me, I cannot convince my nieces and nephews. They will be saying, look, why should we support them? We are poor ourselves. Our country is poor and all these things. And then these rich countries, as if this is a charity, like benevolence, Professor Nargis is saying. So the idea is there is this barrier, the scholars or people like us who do the research, we might become a little bit more empathized. But the issue is there is a huge challenge. And I think on that note, refugees have some responsibilities for themselves because including our research, there will be research after research among the host communities. They feel like it is evident, if not all, majority of not them are involved, but there are some handful of refugees that might be involved in criminal activities. There might be some activities which might be called as security threats. there are some elements of truth. They also need to be able to aware and do something about to mitigate those from the beginning, because we are hearing that they have agencies, their resilience, their agency, like Professor Bill has said, like cactus to survive against all the odds. It has to be also them. I'm not saying entirely them. So please take note of this nuance. But if given the opportunity, they will be able to use their community energy, cohesion, and other aspects to mitigate all these issues and address those before it comes out and played out, of course, by some geopolitical masters. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kamrujaman. I'm really personally, I'm not a speaker today, but I'm very happy that this kind of deeply engaged and very reflective discussions, when we can express our deep emotion and commitment. So that's what actually is making this event more appealing to the global community. So now I will welcome Professor Nargis Kanefi for follow-up discussions, please. Yeah, unmute, please.
Yes, thank you. I thank you very much. I followed Professor Eckeson's lead and looked at some of the comments in the chat. There's more coming. But obviously I cannot address all of them. The one that really caught my attention is temporary protection regimes. Temporary protection regimes are the rule, not the exception, across the globe. And that actually includes Europe as well. The Ukrainians today in Poland and in Germany and many other countries are being welcome, integrated through temporary protection regimes. So as the numbers increase, these regimes become much more commonly embraced and they're legalized. And I think that's part of the conceptual problem that we're dealing with as a field, if we are a field, if we are a composite field. The more we configure refugee flows and mass forced displacement as an exception, the more we'll fail to produce meaningful scholarship on it. This is not an exception, and there's a growing argument. The tenor of the argument being that mass displacement and refugees now constitute a global proletariat class that is disposable, that is flexible, that's amenable, that's much easier to exploit through informal recruitment in certain high-risk sectors. That includes agriculture, that includes food packing, mining, construction. These sectors are often sectors that are very, very high risk in terms of death ratio and workplace accidents. So this is another angle to look at it. Temporary protection regimes actually somehow regulate these mass induction of new labor, and without necessarily embroiling the state with the usual responsibilities that it has under administrative law and labor law. So that's another aspect of it. I am very interested in both Bree's lab and then also Professor Silcock's media representation work. So I'd love to learn more. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions in the chat box, and I will request our panelists to look at the chat box so that there's a couple of questions to the specific panelists. At the same time, I will request the participants here in the Zoom platform, please raise your hand after the follow-up discussion of Professor Bill. Please, Professor Bill.
The only thing I want to add is picking up on what Nigris, am I pronouncing that correctly, just said. And
Yeah.
that is, when you talked about temporary protection regimes, there are all kinds of terms that journalists maybe don't know and should know, but clearly the audiences don't know them. So as a conduit, one of the future works, if it's not already done, it needs to be a chapter, or it needs to be, I'm trying to get communities to talk to each other. But you could create a taxonomy of terms about refugees, the whole field of refugees. And maybe there's already a book out there. I'm sorry, I don't know the literature that well. But if there isn't, there should be, or at least a good chapter, because then that could be taken from a scholarly academic point of view and turn around and create, common terms that journalists could be using. Because I think, we have a lot of reporters that cover the border, obviously, here in Arizona. And there's national reporters in the United States too. They'll know some of these terms, just like if someone was covering, SpaceX or NASA or something. There's all kinds of internal stuff that people speak, they speak space speak. Well, we probably speak, refugees speak. And that's good for lots of reasons, because we have to, have lots of different constituents and stakeholders, governments and NGOs and stuff like that. But we have to make sure, and I'll end with this, we just have to make sure that we can translate the languages back and forth, the different audiences that we need to be responsible for, and then that we're also serving. But Nasser, yes, let's go. There's questions piling up and we should get to those.
Yeah, so is there any specific point that you want to address from the chat box, or otherwise I will just choose and pick so that
you moderate. You're doing a great job.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Nirgis has her hand up.
Nargis, please, Nargis.
Okay, I'm just going to talk about the dignified return and concerning Bill's concern. I think journalists have the know-how most commonly of contacting the local authority guidebooks, because every constituency has its own terminology. From a bird's eye view, they all culminate to temporary protection if they are given a limited duration for residence and conscribed sectors of work, subject to possible renewal, but open-ended. That's temporary protection, right? If they're given humanitarian protection, that's kind of an extension of the Refugee Convention, so that has a more fringe benefits, but temporary protection is the least. And it basically creates a working class that's disposable. On that, dignified repatriation. So I'm going to go to Professor Kamazaman's comments. The Rohingya population has been devalued and basically taken out of the citizenry registry much earlier than the mass exodus. And therefore, it's just my personal sense, having dealt with conflicts in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, a dignified repatriation under current Myanmar political circumstances, especially taking into account the political economy of their exodus and who benefited from it, who has vested interest, seems to be not possible. So yes, sure, that should be an option, but I am looking at the mass exodus trends historically. I have not yet seen a single incidence of dignified repatriation of these mass exodus trends. So this is a cleansing impulse. These populations get regionally absorbed. I know it's not a very hopeful take, but anyone, and Nasir is the absolute expert on this, knowing Myanmar's history, I'm not quite sure even they would want to go back under the current circumstances. So.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of debates about it. So better, I will actually go back to, to choose and pick a couple of questions which are very much relevant. And we are supposed to end up in 6 or 7 minutes, but if you don't mind, I will take more 10 minutes additional so that we can make it more, I would request all the panelists to look at the chat in the chat box. There are a lot of questions. You can respond actually in the chat box, couple of questions. So I'm picking up one question. Professor Faridul Alam is a professor of international relations. He wrote questions, and for all the panelists, the question is, it is reported that 73% of the refugees are living in the lower income countries who are not being supported well by the international communities. At the same time, current wars have created more in numbers. We are living in the war time currently. In the experience of Bangladesh, we cannot expect the Rohingya to be repatriated soon. That's what Nargis was talking about. Is the same situation is relevant for many others. So in a word, can we say that the international mechanism has completely failed? If so, what to do? Anyone can respond. Why the number of refugees are increasing day by day globally? That's a big question. When refugee convention was enacted in 1951, at that time, refugee and following the protocol and a lot of international legal protection mechanism was adopted, a different frame, and also a lot of regional refugee protection mechanism we have in hands, but still the number of refugee on the rise. Why? Is the failure of international refugee protection mechanism? Anybody respond? It's a very vital
Maybe
question.
I'll just a few initial thoughts without even thinking really deeply about this. I think number one, I think we're in a spot where in our understanding of refugee issues and humanitarianism where we can rethink how we're doing things. So I don't see anything as a complete failure. I always think of things as if they are not working right, there's always ways to reinvent. And I think something that Dr. Kamruzaman mentioned was we also have to look at root causes. So we're always talking, when we talk about refugees, we're talking about do they have enough to eat? Do they have enough healthcare access? Where are they living? And these things are really important, but these are like, they're not the root causes. The root causes are conflicts, right? And climate change and all these disasters. So how do we, as a society, address those things when we have such powerful people making decisions that are going to affect, millions of lives and create more refugees? So I don't think it's necessarily a failure. And maybe I always describe myself as a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist. So I do see the value of these kinds of mechanisms that exist, but I always think there's opportunities for reinventing. Like the UN system it's amazing what we've created in the last 70 years. It's amazing it doesn't work. It doesn't work perfectly, but it's the system that we can work with and make better. So that would be my kind of understanding of this, but I'm happy to hear others' thoughts on it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Anybody
if
else?
I may, I'd like
Yeah,
to
please.
add to this point. The failure of the international mechanism, and the phrasing is has it completely failed? I mean, it's like in a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situations. There's so many examples where there are good examples international mechanism have done well, even for the refugees. Imagine if there was not this tokenistic or small amount of aid. All the 73% of the people, refugees who are being hosted in these low middle income countries, what would these countries do? Imagine if there was no aid for these people. So this, as I said, and maybe Bree has said this, she's short-term pessimist and long-term optimist. That's another way of saying things half full and glass half full and glass half empty. But what I disagree with Bree is about the United Nations mechanism is great. I don't think so. It is a broken system. It has been broken for a long time, and that's why I think the perspective from Global North and Global South needs to be taken into account, right? Here, look at the panelists, the voices, the authority in their tone, everything. Only 5 countries have veto power for many different issues. The World Bank, the biggest donor, the IMF, one country has the veto power. It's the weighted voting system there. There will be trade mechanisms where the rich countries gang up on the poor countries. What I feel that the international mechanism has failed to address and upheld the notion of justice. Allow me to explain the aspects of Rohingya or Congo's issue in Africa, or Syria, and let's say 3 cases. In all cases, there have been perpetrators who caused something that have made this number of people become refugees all of a sudden. And I tell everybody, imagine you are now today, and tomorrow, if anything happens for whatever reasons, as I said, my colleagues, my friends who were industrialists in another country, all of a sudden they found themselves living on benefits. Life is difficult. In the camps, life is not luxurious.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, these people are refugee, they're homeless, they're displaced. Now, it is not their fault.
Yeah.
If there was an international border mechanism working, then let's say we, that should have been able to punish those people who perpetrated and committed these atrocities and violent crimes. That has not happened in Congo, in Rohingya, in Myanmar, also in Syria. Why? We know this story. We know the reasons, the geopolitics, the business, the arms industry, the biggest donor of political parties.
Yeah, thank you.
It will still go on, refugee numbers will increase, no doubt.
Thank you so much. We want to end up this discussion on this topic particularly. Yeah, there's a kind of failure, but at the same time, we also need to acknowledge the contribution of international communities to support to run the refugee camp across the world. So now there are a lot of questions, the chat box, and I have received a lot of questions, but we do not have too much time. But it indicates that the discussions the panelist has brought up a couple of very appealing questions that has actually generated a kind of interest among the participants. So I'm so happy that the people are engaging and participating in the discussions. I want to bring one question to all of panelists. That is how is there any suggestions from Iran how to include refugee participations in the policy framing? There's a big questions. The participation of refugee, we are planning different kind of policies are being framed without the participation of the refugees. What could be the potential ways to include refugee voice in the policy framing? Please, anyone can come up, please. Yeah, Nargis, Professor Nargis.
So I'm going to speak rather sharply. A lot of the academic energy has been directed towards measuring numbers, looking into options of repatriation, looking at the dire scenarios so that the next generation of refugees will not become a threat to the society, whether in the camps or in the urban setting. So a lot of the scholarly energy has been flowing in that direction, including grant money. But very little has been spent on actual consultations with refugee communities. And the framework is that the host society knows best. That's how they do things. That's the way it's going to be. And often it leads to kind of prolonged issues. So one way is to do the consultations. And someone asked in the questions whether the high-tech companies, the big ones, contributed to refugee welfare. Thus far, the research indicates that they have really been involved in identification, fingerprinting, profiling, but they can also be used, the same technologies can be used in terms of needs determination. And I don't mean needs, immediate needs, such as very basic stuff. Who has what qualification? All right. Most of the time, it's not known. It doesn't register. UNHCR uses it so that some of the refugees in the global south can be kind of handpicked and brought to global north. But other than that, there's no register about the qualifications of the people.
Yeah.
So that's one area. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Actually, yeah, this is one way the refugee researcher could actually, accommodate refugee voices and which could be part of the policy framing. Is there any other way, Bree, Bill, Professor Kamrujaman? Any other way? How could we actually bring refugee voice in the policy framing?
The problem is, if I may, I have been waited and I thought I should not.
Just one minute, please.
It's just like, is there a will? It seems like there is no political will to involve the refugees rather than in a tokenistic way. For the project we develop or the project we have money for, we have only options for tokenistically include the refugees there, right? That's number one. And then if you look at the aid workers, in many places, the global north workers dictate in the global south refugee places as if host community professionals, they're not trusted. So the issue is there is this lack of trust. And then you see how the office thing work, somebody will be there for 6 months or 2 years, and then they will move on from Congo to Somalia or to Ukraine. They would like to be close to their home, right? Who doesn't? The problem is, how do they have a space? So my question, in responding to this question, it seems like there is no political will or the tokenistic will, and then there is not enough space to include them because that's how aid is structured or current humanitarian support is formed.
Thank you. Yeah, this will is also a very related term. And Bill and Bree, anyone?
The last thing I'll say, just building on Palash, sorry, comments earlier about dignity and what you were just talking about, because there's another question in the thread about technology, and there's an interesting Foucault discussion, which I'm glad we're not getting into now, although I'd love to have that because I think we can learn a lot from critical cultural scholars. But I think one of the things, and I know an NGO, a guy in DC who used to get money from USAID, which doesn't exist anymore, but hopefully he'll figure out a way to work it. He would put phones into the hands of the refugees, and let them tell their stories. I mean, you all in the United States, people are familiar with a program on NPR called StoryCorps. But I think empowering the technology, so that they can do, microeconomics, so they can, do whatever they need to do to get food, shelter, get the basic mass hierarchy of needs met, but also to record their stories of what's going on. That's been the most powerful thing in doing these projects of the last 10 years, especially most recently with the Ukrainian war refugees, which is different. But I just think it's interesting that we let them tell their own story and get out of the way. And that's very hard in a global media economy that's driven by dollars and driven by TikTok and driven by likes and algorithms.
Brief 1 minute for you. Last comment.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what I agree with everything everybody's saying. And I think just being on the ground with people, sitting accompaniment, I'm thinking of Paul Farmer's work of accompaniment and sitting with people and listening and talking. And I'm so lucky to have such a wonderful research team who is, most of them are Rohingya refugees themselves, and they're able to share with me their own experiences and what they think about the questions that we're asking, and they're telling me. So I think being there with people, accompanying them along on this, really challenging part of their life, and then being able to bring that back to people who aren't able to experience it, I think is a really great way to do that. And that to me is like participation. That's how participation enters into research and enters into policy and things like that. And again, not just tokenism, but actual real conversations, sitting down with people, breaking bread, right? So.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful discussions. Actually, you could continue, and I'm so happy that's very engaging, very participatory, very reflective based on our panelists' own experience. I want to just wrap up. Before just wrapping up, I would like to welcome Dr. Bias, the PI of the project. This event is supported by University College London. As part of one of the project's activities, the politics of denial and non-recognitions of genocide. So Bias is the PI of the project. I would welcome Bias to say just 1 or 2 minutes, then I will wrap up. Professor Bias.
Yes, sorry, it's really, my daughter is making noise, all right. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I mean, thank you, everyone. It was lovely and very engaging, and I think impactful webinar, I would say. I mean, but it is time to really think about some questions raised by our audience, like why the number is ever increasing. Every year, this is being added. The number is being added into the millions, isn't it? And 2 types of refugees quickly, it really took my attraction. One is, of course, the war and conflict related refugees, and another we barely talk about as climate refugees. Although UN said you should not use refugee for climate induced migrants, IDMC and other organizations. And we also conduct extensive research on disaster, like environmental disaster linked refugees or migrants or internally displaced people. So both came into the discussion, but where is the global issue actually? I mean, the I mean, I think it's a failure. I mean, I think we all are afraid of because we are being targeted. Because personally, I have my personal experience, and of course, some of my colleagues here, I know them. They have been targeted for writing about human rights, for writing about what is true, what is honest, and the fact. And back in my country, your house can be burned down. Trust me. If you say something and people do not like your opinion, even that is true, that is fact, and that is in line with the UN Human Rights Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, but you remember there are some oppositions. They might simply terminate your job for a university. They will find you wherever you are. Even you can be killed in abroad. You can be targeted abroad, humiliated in abroad, and your hometown, your house can be burned down. So this is happening globally. So I mean, I would say it is time to think about. Sorry, my daughter is making. I don't know what she's looking for. So I think it is quickly time about. We need to think deep inside. Actually, who are those superpowers? Inflicting conflict, violence, war, who themselves created the law, the courts, and the conventions, and they're violating it, cherry picking some of the events. And those people who really want to uplift the law and human rights, they're being targeted. It's time to integrate everything into one framework. Probably then the number of refugees that are increasing, ever increasing every year, can be reduced to zero. Hopefully, there'll be zero refugees one day, and we don't need to observe this day any longer. So that should be our future.
Thank you.
And yes, let's hope for a peaceful world.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you, all of you, all the panelists, and I just want to read out one sentence to wrap up this event. Thank you, Professor Bria Kisan. Thank you, Professor Palash Kemrujaman. Thank you, Professor Nargis Kanafi, and thank you, Professor Bill Silcock, for your wonderful, engaging participations and wonderful experience sharing with the audience. So I would say today is a solidarity with refugees. This is the call by UN. The solidarity means honoring refugees, not just with words, but with actions. It means listening to them and making spaces for their stories. It means defending their rights to seek safety and finding solutions to their plight, ending conflicts so that they can return home in safety. So what we have done today, actually, we have tried to listen to them. We have tried to, speak on behalf of their stories. We have tried to talk about their dignity, rights, and their dignified return to their homeland. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.